bothering you? Okay, good. I was wondering if I could read in your room tonight. I just didn't want to sit alone. Can I? Okay, thank you. Would it be okay if I read out loud? It's just... I don't like reading in silence, but music in the background is too distracting, so I usually just end up reading out loud to myself. Would that be okay? Cool. Yeah, I got this book of short horror stories, and I wanted to try and read a couple of them. Let me know if I'm being too loud. It's all nonsense, said Jack Barnes. Of course people have died in the house. People die in every house. As for the noises, wind in the chimney and rats in the wainscot are very convincing to a nervous man. Give me another cup of tea, Meagle. Lester and White are first, said Meagle, who was presiding at the tea table of the Three Feathers Inn. You've had two. Lester and White finished their cups with irritating slowness, pausing between sips to sniff the aroma and to discover the sex and dates of arrival of the strangers, which floated in some numbers in the beverage. Mr. Meagle served them to the brim, and then, turning to the grimly expectant Mr. Barnes, blandly requested him to ring for hot water. We'll try and keep your nerves in the present healthy condition, he remarked. For my part, I have a sort of half and half belief in the supernatural. All sensible people have, said Lester. An aunt of mine saw a ghost once. White nodded. I had an uncle that saw one, he said. It always is somebody else that sees them, said Barnes. Well, there is the house, said Meagle. A large house at an absurdly low rent, and nobody will take it. It has taken toll of at least one life of every family that has lived there, however short the time, and since it has stood empty, caretaker after caretaker has died there. The last caretaker died 15 years ago. Exactly, said Barnes. Long enough ago for legends to accumulate. I'll bet you a sovereign you won't spend the night there alone, for all your talk, said White suddenly. And I, said Lester. No, said Barnes slowly. I don't believe in ghosts, nor in any supernatural things whatever. All the same, I admit that I should not care to pass a night there alone. But why not? Inquired White. Wind in the chimney, said Meagle with a grin. Rats in the wainscot, chimed in Lester. As you like, said Barnes, colouring. Suppose we all go, said Meagle. Start after supper, get there about 11. We have been walking for 10 days now, without an adventure, except Barnes' discovery that ditch water smell longest. It will be a novelty, at any rate, and if we break the spell by all surviving, the grateful owner ought to come down handsome. Let's see what the landlord has to say about it first, said Lester. There is no fun in passing a night in an ordinary empty house. Let us make sure that it is haunted. He rang the bell, and, sending for the landlord, appealed to him in the name of our common humanity not to let them waste a night watching in a house in which spectres and hobgoblins had no part. The reply was more than reassuring, and the landlord, after describing with considerable art the exact appearance of a head which had been seen hanging out of a window in the moonlight, wound up with a polite but urgent request that they would settle his bill before they went. It's all very well for you young gentlemen to have your fun, he said indulgently, but, supposing as how you are all found dead in the morning, what about me? It ain't called the Toll House for nothing, you know. Who died there last? Inquired Barnes, with an air of polite derision. A tramp, was the reply. He went there for the sake of half a crown, and they found him next morning hanging from the balusters, dead. Suicide, said Barnes. Unsound mind. The landlord nodded. That's what the jury brought it in, he said slowly. But his mind was sound enough when he went in there. I'd known him, off and on for years. I'm a poor man, but I wouldn't spend the night in that house for £100. He repeated this remark as they started on their expedition a few hours later. They left as the inn was closing for the night. Bolts shot noisily behind them, and, as the regular customers trudged slowly homewards, they set off at a brisk pace in the direction of the house. Most of the cottages were already in darkness, and lights in others went out as they passed. It seems rather hard that we have got to lose a night's rest in order to convince Barnes of the existence of ghosts, said White. It's in a good cause, said Meagle, a most worthy object, and something seems to tell me that we shall succeed. You didn't forget the candles, Lester? I've brought 2, was the reply, all the old man could spare. There was but little moon, and the night was cloudy. The road between high hedges was dark, and in one place, where it ran through a wood, so black that they twice stumbled in the uneven ground at the sight of it. Fancy leaving our comfortable beds for this, said White again. Let me see. This desirable residential sepulchre lies to the right, doesn't it? Farther on, said Meagle. They walked on for some time in silence, broken only by White's tribute to the softness, the cleanliness, and the comfort of the bed, which was receding farther and farther into the distance. Under Meagle's guidance, they turned off at last to the right, and, after a walk of 1/4 of a mile, saw the gates of the house before them. The lodge was almost hidden by overgrown shrubs, and the drive was choked with rank growths. Meagle leading, they pushed through it until the dark pile of the house loomed over them. There is a window at the back where we can get in, so the landlord says, said Lester, as they stood before the hall door. Window? Said Meagle. Nonsense. Let's do the thing properly. Where's the knocker? He felt for it in the darkness and gave a thundering rat-tat-tat at the door. Don't play the fool, said Barnes crossly. Ghostly servants are all asleep, said Meek gravely, but I'll wake them up before I've done with them. It's scandalous keeping us out here in the dark. He plied the knocker again, and the noise volleyed in the emptiness beyond. Then, with a sudden exclamation, he put out his hands and stumbled forward. Why, it was open all the time, he said, with an odd catch in his voice. Come on. I don't believe it was open, said Lester, hanging back. Somebody is playing us a trick. Nonsense, said Meagle sharply. Give me a candle. Thanks. Who's got a match? Barnes produced a box and struck one, and Meagle, shielding the candle with his hand, led the way forward to the foot of the stairs. Shut the door, somebody, he said. There's too much draught. It is shut, said White, glancing behind him. Meagle fingered his chin. Who shut it? He inquired, looking from one to the other. Who came in last? I did, said Lester, but I don't remember shutting it. Perhaps I did, though. Meagle, about to speak, thought better of it, and, still carefully guarding the flame, began to explore the house, with the others close behind. Shadows danced on the walls and lurked in the corners as they proceeded. At the end of the passage they found a second staircase, and descending it slowly gained the first floor. Careful, said Meagle, as they gained the landing. He held the candle forward and showed where the balusters had broken away. Then he peered curiously into the void beneath. This is where the tramp hanged himself, I suppose, he said thoughtfully. You've got an unwholesome mind, said White, as they walked on. This place is quite creepy enough, without you remembering that. Now let's find a comfortable room and have a little nip of whiskey apiece and a pipe. How will this do? He opened a door at the end of the passage, and revealed a small square room. Meagle led the way with the candle, and, first melting a drop or two of tallow, stuck it on the mantelpiece. The others seated themselves on the floor and watched pleasantly as White drew from his pocket a small bottle of whiskey and a tin cup. I've forgotten the water," he exclaimed. "I'll soon get some," said Meagle. He tugged violently at the bell handle, and the rusty jangling of a bell sounded from a distant kitchen. He rang again. "Don't play the fool," said Barnes roughly. Meagle laughed. "I only wanted to convince you," he said kindly. "There ought to be, at any rate, one ghost in the servants' hall." Barnes held up his hand for silence. "Yes?" said Meagle, with a grin at the other two. "Is anybody coming?" "Suppose we drop this game and go back," said Barnes suddenly. "I don't believe in spirits, but nerves are outside anybody's command. You may laugh as you like, but it really seemed to me that I heard a door open below and steps on the stairs." His voice was drowned in a roar of laughter. "He is coming around," said Meagle with a smirk. "By the time I have done with him, he will be a confirmed believer. Well, who will go and get some water? Will you, Barnes?" "No," was the reply. "If there is any, it might not be safe to drink after all these years," said Lester. "We must do without it." Meagle nodded, and taking a seat on the floor held out his hand for the cup. Pipes were lit, and the clean, wholesome smell of tobacco filled the room. White produced a pack of cards. Talk and laughter rang through the room and died away reluctantly in distant corridors. "Empty rooms always delude me into the belief that I possess a deep voice," said Meagle. "Tomorrow He started up with a smothering exclamation as the light went out suddenly and someone struck him on the head. The others sprang to their feet. Then Meagle laughed. "It's the candle," he exclaimed. "I didn't stick it enough." Barnes struck a match, and relighting the candle, stuck it on the mantelpiece, and sitting down took up his cards again. "What was I going to say?" said Meagle. "Oh, I know. Tomorrow Listen," said White, laying his hand on the other's sleeve. "Upon my word, I really thought I heard a laugh." "Look here," said Barnes. "What do you say to going back? I've had enough of this. I keep fancying that I hear things too, sounds of something moving about in the passage outside. I know it's only fancy, but it's uncomfortable." "You go if you want to," said Meagle, "and we will play dummy. Or you might ask the tramp to take your hand for you as you go downstairs." Barnes shivered and exclaimed angrily. He got up and, walking to the half-closed door, listened. "Go outside," said Meagle, winking at the other two. "I'll dare you to go down to the hall door and back up by yourself." Barnes came back and, bending forward, lit his pipe at the candle. "I am nervous, but rational," he said, blowing out a thin cloud of smoke. "My nerves tell me that there is something prowling up and down the long passage outside. My reason tells me that that is all nonsense. Where are my cards?" He sat down again, and taking up his hand looked through it carefully and led. "Your play, White," he said after a pause. White made no sign. "Why, he's asleep," said Meagle. "Wake up, old man. Wake up and play." Lester, who was sitting next to him, took the sleeping man by the arm and shook him, gently at first and then with some roughness, but White, with his back against the wall and his head bowed, made no sign. Meagle bawled in his ear, and then turned a puzzled face to the others. "He sleeps like the dead," he said, grimacing. "Well, there are still 3 of us to keep each other company." "Yes," said Lester, nodding. "Unless... Good Lord, suppose..." He broke off, and eyed them, trembling. "Suppose what?" inquired Meagle. "Nothing," stammered Lester. "Let's wake him. Try him again. White. White." "It's no good," said Meagle seriously. "There's something wrong about that sleep." "That's what I meant," said Lester. "And if he goes to sleep like that, why shouldn't..." Meagle sprang to his feet. "Nonsense," he said roughly. "He's a tired out, that's all." Still, let's take him up and clear out. You take his legs and Barnes will lead the way with a candle. Yes? Who's that? He looked up quickly towards the door. Thought I heard somebody tap, he said, with a shamefaced laugh. Now, Lester, up with him. 1, 2... Lester. Lester. He sprang forward too late. Lester, with his face buried in his arms, had rolled over on the floor fast asleep, and his utmost efforts failed to awake him. He is asleep, he stammered. Asleep. Barnes, who had taken the candle from the mantelpiece, stood peering at the sleepers in silence and dropping tallow over the floor. We must get out of this, said Meagle. Quick. Barnes hesitated. We can't leave them here, he began. We must, said Meagle, in strident tones. If you go to sleep, I shall go. Quick, come. He seized the other by the arm and strove to drag him to the door. Barnes shook him off and, putting the candle back on the mantelpiece, tried again to arouse the sleepers. It's no good, he said at last, and, turning from them, watched Meagle. Don't you go to sleep, he said anxiously. Meagle shook his head, and they stood for some time in uneasy silence. May as well shut the door, said Barnes at last. He crossed over and closed it gently. Then, at a scuffling noise behind him, he turned and saw Meagle in a heap of the hearthstone. With a sharp catch in his breath, he stood motionless. Inside the room, the candle, fluttering in the draught, showed dimly the grotesque attitudes of the sleepers. Beyond the door, there seemed to this overwrought imagination a strange and stealthy unrest. He tried to whistle, but his lips were parched, and in a mechanical fashion he stooped and began to pick up the cards which littered the floor. He stopped once or twice and stood with bent head listening. The unrest outside seemed to increase. A loud creaking sounded from the stairs. Who is there? He cried loudly. The creaking ceased. He crossed to the door and, flinging it open, strode out into the corridor. As he walked, his fears left him suddenly. Come on, he cried with a low laugh. All of you, show your faces. Your infernal, ugly faces. Don't skulk. He laughed again and walked on, and the heap in the fireplace put out its head tortoise fashion and listened in horror to the retreating footsteps. Not until they had become inaudible in the distance did the listener's features relax. Good Lord, Lester, we've driven him mad, he said, in a frightening whisper. We must go after him. There was no reply. Meagle sprang to his feet. Do you hear? He cried. Stop your fooling now. This is serious. White, Lester, do you hear? He bent and surveyed them in angry bewilderment. All right, he said in a trembling voice. You won't frighten me, you know. He turned away and walked with exaggerated carelessness in the direction of the door. He even went outside and peeped through the crack, but the sleepers did not stir. He glanced into the blackness behind, and then came hastily into the room again. He stood for a few seconds regarding them. The stillness in the house was horrible. He could not even hear them breathe. With a sudden resolution, he snatched the candle from the mantelpiece and held the flame to White's finger. Then, as he reeled back stupefied, the footsteps again became audible. He stood with the candle in his shaking hand, listening. He heard them ascending the farther staircase, but they stopped suddenly as he went to the door. He walked a little way along the passage, and they went scurrying down the stairs, and then at a jog trot along the corridor below. He went back to the main staircase, and they ceased again. For a time he hung over the balusters, listening and trying to pierce the blackness below. Then, slowly, step by step, he made his way downstairs, and, holding the candle above his head, peered about him. Barnes, he called, where are you? Shaking with fright, he made his way along the passage, and summoning up all his courage, pushed open doors and gazed fearfully into empty rooms. Then, quite suddenly, he heard the footsteps in front of him. He followed slowly for fear of extinguishing the candle, until they led him at last into a vast bare kitchen, with damp walls and a broken floor. In front of him a door, leading into an inside room, just closed. He ran towards it and flung it open, and the cold air blew out the candle. He stood aghast. "Barnes," he cried, "don't be afraid, it is I, Meagle." There was no answer. He stood gazing into the darkness, and all the time the idea of something close at hand watching was upon him. Then suddenly the steps broke out overhead again. He drew back hastily, and passing through the kitchen groped his way along the narrow passages. He could now see better in the darkness, and finding himself at last at the foot of the staircase, began to ascend it noiselessly. He reached the landing just in time to see a figure disappear round the angle of a wall. Still careful to make no noise, he followed the sound of the footsteps until they led him to the top floor, and he cornered the chase at the end of the short passage. "Barnes," he whispered. "Barnes." Something stirred in the darkness. A small circular window at the end of the passage just softened the blackness and revealed the dim outlines of a motionless figure. Meagle, in place of advancing, stood almost as still as a sudden horrible doubt took possession of him. With his eyes fixed on the shape in front, he fell back slowly, and, as it advanced upon him, burst into a terrible cry. "Barnes, for God's sake, is it you?" The echoes of his voice left the air quivering, but the figure before him paid no heed. For a moment he tried to brace his courage up to endure its approach, then with a smothered cry he turned and fled. The passages wound like a maze, and he threaded them blindly in a vain search for the stairs. If he could get down and open the hall door. He caught his breath in a sob. The steps had begun again. At a lumbering trot they clattered up and down the bare passages, in and out, up and down, as though in search of him. He stood appalled, and then, as they drew near, entered a small room and stood behind the door as they rushed by. He came out and ran swiftly and noiselessly in the other direction, and in a moment the steps were after him. He found the long corridor and raced along it at top speed. The stairs he knew were at the end, and with the steps close behind him, he descended them in blind haste. The steps gained on him, and he shrank to the side to let them pass, still continuing his headlong flight. Then suddenly he seemed to slip off into space. Lester awoke in the morning to find the sunshine streaming into the room, and White sitting up and regarding with some perplexity a badly blistered finger. "Where are the others?" inquired Lester. "Gone, I suppose," said White. "We must have been asleep." Lester arose and, stretching his stiffened limbs, dusted his clothes with his hands and went out into the corridor. White followed. At the noise of their approach, a figure, which had been lying asleep at the other end, sat up and revealed the face of Barnes. "Why, I've been asleep," he said in surprise. "I don't remember coming here. How did I get here?" "Nice place to come for a nap," said Lester severely, as he pointed to the gap of the balusters. "Look there. Another yard, and where would you have been?" He walked carelessly to the edge and looked over. In response to this startled cry, the others drew near, and all three stood staring at the dead man below. I think maybe there's time for one other one. Yeah, I think so too. Okay. Let's see. Nuremberg at the time was not so much exploited as it has been since then. Irving had not been playing Faust, and the very name of the old town was hardly known to the great bulk of the traveling public. My wife and I, being in the second week of our honeymoon, naturally wanted someone else to join our party, so that when the cheery stranger, Elias P. Hutchison, hailing from Isthmian City, Bleeding Gulch, Maple Tree County, Nebraska, turned up at the station at Frankfurt, and casually remarked that he was going on to see the most all-fired old Methuselah of a town in Europe, and that he guessed that so much traveling alone was enough to send an intelligent, active citizen into the melancholy ward of a daft house. We took the pretty broad hint and suggested we should join forces. We found, on comparing notes afterwards, that we had each intended to speak with some diffidence or hesitation so as not to appear too eager, such not being a good compliment to the success of our married life, but the effect was entirely marred by our both beginning to speak at the same instant, stopping simultaneously and then going on together again. Anyhow, no matter how, it was done, and Elias B. Hutchison became one of our party. Straight away, Amelia and I found the pleasant benefit. Instead of quarreling, as we had been doing, we found that the restraining influence of a third party was such that we now took every opportunity of spooning in odd corners. Amelia declares that ever since she has, as the result of that experience, advised all her friends to take a friend on the honeymoon. Well, we did Nuremberg together, and much enjoyed the racy remarks of our transatlantic friend, who, from his quaint speech and his wonderful stock of adventures, might have stepped out of a novel. We kept for the last object of interest in the city to be visited the Burg, and on the day appointed for the visit strolled round the outer wall of the city by the eastern side. The Burg is seated on a rock dominating the town, and an immensely deep fosse guards it on the northern side. Nuremberg has been happy in that it was never sacked. Had it been, it would certainly not be so spick and span perfect as it is in the present. The ditch has not been used for centuries, and now its base is spread with tea gardens and orchards, of which some of the trees are of quite respectable growth. As we wandered round the wall, dawdling in the hot July sunshine, we often paused to admire the views spread before us, and in especial the great plain covered with towns and villages and bound with a blue line of hills, like a landscape of Claude Lorraine. From this we always turned with new delight to the city itself, with its myriad of quaint old gables and acre-wide red roofs, dotted with dormer windows, tier upon tier. A little to our right rose the tower of the Burg, and nearer still, standing grim, the torture tower, which was and is perhaps the most interesting place in the city. For centuries the tradition of the Iron Virgin of Nuremberg had been handed down as an instance of the horrors of cruelty of which man is capable. We had long looked forward to seeing it, and here at last was its home. In one of our pauses we leaned over the wall of the moat and looked down. The garden seemed quite 50 or 60 feet below us, and the sun pouring into it with an intense, moveless heat like that of an oven. Beyond rose the grey, grim wall seemingly of endless height, and losing itself right and left in the angles of bastion and counterscarp. Trees and bushes crowned the wall, and above again towered the lofty houses, on whose massive beauty time has only set the hand of approval. The sun was hot and we were lazy. Time was our own, and we lingered, leaning on the wall. Just below us was a pretty sight. A great black cat lying stretched out in the sun, whilst round her gamboled prettily a tiny black kitten. The mother would wave her tail for the kitten to play with, or would raise her feet and push away the little one as an encouragement to further play. They were just at the foot of the wall, and Elias B. Hutchison, in order to help the play, stooped and took from the walk a moderate-sized pebble. "See," he said, "I will drop it near the kitten, and they will both wonder where it came from." "Oh, be careful," said my wife. "You might hit the dear little thing." "Not me, ma'am," said Elias B. "Why, I'm as tender as a Maine cherry tree, Lord bless you. I wouldn't hurt the poor pooty little critter no more. I read that wrong. I wouldn't hurt the poor pooty little critter more than I would scalp a baby. Don't know why that was so hard for me to say. And you may bet your variegated socks on that. See, I'll drop it far away on the outside, so as not to go near her. Thus saying, he leaned over and held his arm out at full length and dropped the stone. It may be that there is some attractive force which draws lesser matters to greater, or more probably that the wall was not plump but sloped to its base, we not noticing the inclination from above, but the stone fell with a sickening thud that came upon us through the hot air right on the kitten's head, and shattered out its little brains then and there. The black cat cast a swift upwards glance, and we saw her eyes like green fire fixed on instant on Elias P. Hutchison, and then her attention was given to the kitten, which lay still with just a quiver of her tiny limbs, whilst a thin red stream trickled from a gaping wound. With a muffled cry, such as a human being might give, she bent over the kitten, licking its wounds and moaning. Suddenly, she seemed to realize that it was dead, and again threw her eyes up at us. I shall never forget the sight, for she looked the perfect incarnation of hate. Her green eyes blazed with lurid fire, and the white, sharp teeth seemed to almost shine through the blood which dabbled her mouth and whiskers. She gnashed her teeth, and her claws stood out stark and at full length on every paw. Then she made a wild rush up the wall, as if to reach us, but when the momentum ended, fell back, and further added to her horrible appearance, for she fell on the kitten, and rose with her black fur smeared with its brains and blood. Amelia turned quite faint, and I had to lift her back from the wall. There was a seat close by in shade of a spreading plane tree, and here I placed her while she composed herself. Then I went back to Hutchison, who stood without moving, looking down on the angry cat below. As I joined him, he said, "Well, I guess that air the savagest beast I've ever seen, except once when I saw an Apache squaw had an edge of an half-breed, what they nicknamed Splinters, because of the way he fixed up her papoose, which he stole on a raid, just to show that he appreciated the way they had given his mother the fire torture. She got that kinder look so to set on her face, that it just seemed to grow there. She followed Splinters more than 3 years, till at last the braves got him, and handed him over to her. They did say that no man, white or Injun, had ever been so long a-dying under the tortures of the Apaches. The only time I ever see her smile was when I wiped her out. I came on the camp just in time to see Splinters pass in his checks, and he wasn't sorry to go either. He was a hard citizen, and thought I never could shake with him after that papoose business, for it was bitter bad, and he should have been a white man, for he looked like one. I see he got paid out in full. Darn me. But I took a piece of his hide from one of his skinning posts, and had it made into a pocketbook. It's here now," and he slapped the breast pocket of his coat. Whilst he was speaking, the cat was continuing her frantic efforts to get up the wall. She would take a run back and then charge up, sometimes reaching an incredible height. She did not seem to mind the heavy fall which she got each time, but started with renewed vigor, and at every tumble her appearance became more horrible. Hutchison was a kind-hearted man. My wife and I had both noticed little acts of kindness to animals as well as to persons, and he seemed concerned at the state of fury to which the cat had wrought herself. "Well now," he said, "I do declare that poor critter seems quite desperate. There, poor thing, it was all an accident, though that won't bring back your little one to you. Say, I wouldn't have done such a thing. Just shows what a clumsy fool of a man can do when he tries to play. Seems I'm too darn slipper-handed to even play with a cat. Say, Colonel, it was a pleasant way he had to bestow titles freely. I hope your wife doesn't hold a grudge against me on account of this unpleasantness. Why, I wouldn't have it occur on no account." He came over to Amelia and apologized profusely. and she, with her usual kindness of heart, hastened to assure him that she quite understood that it was an accident. Then we all went again to the wall and looked over. The cat missing Hutchison's face had drawn back across the moat and was sitting on her haunches, as though ready to spring. Indeed, the very instant she saw him, she did spring, and with a blind, unreasoning fury, which would have been grotesque, only that it was so frightfully real. She did not try to run up the wall, but simply launched herself at him, as though hate and fury could lend her wings to pass straight through the great distance between them. Amelia, womanlike, got quite concerned, and said to Elias P. in a warning voice, "Oh, you must be very careful. That animal would try to kill you if she were here." Her eyes looked like positive murder. He laughed out jovially. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, "but I can't help but laugh. Fancy a man that has fought grizzlies and Injuns being careful of being murdered by a cat." When the cat heard him laugh, her whole demeanor seemed to change. She no longer tried to jump or run up the wall, but went quietly over, and sitting again beside the dead kitten, began to lick and fondle it as though it were alive. "See," said I, "the effect of a really strong man. Even that animal in the midst of her fury recognizes the voice of a master and bows to him." "Like a squaw," was the only comment of Elias B. Hutchison, as we moved on our way round the city fosse. Every now and then we looked over the wall and each time saw the cat following us. At first she had kept going back to the dead kitten, and then, as the distance grew greater, took it in her mouth as she followed. After a while, however, she abandoned this, for we saw her following all alone. She had evidently hidden the body somewhere. Amelia's alarm grew at the cat's persistence, and more than once she repeated her warning, but the American always laughed with amusement, till finally, seeing that she was beginning to be worried, he said, "I say, ma'am, you needn't be scared over that cat. I go heeled, I do." Here he slapped his pistol pocket at the back of his lumbar region. "Why, sooner if you worried, I'll shoot the critter, right here, and risk the police interfering with a citizen of the United States for carrying arms contrary to regulations." As he spoke, he looked over the wall, but the cat, on seeing him, retreated, with a growl, into a bed of tall flowers, and was hidden. He went on, Blessed if that critter ain't got more sense of what's good for her than most Christians. I guess we've seen the last of her. You bet she'll go back now to that busted kitten, and have a private funeral of it all to herself." Amelia did not like to say more, lest he might, in mistaken kindness to her, fulfill his threat of shooting the cat, and so we went on and crossed the little wooden bridge leading to the gateway, whence ran the steep paved roadway between the burg and the pentagonal torture tower. As we crossed the bridge, we saw the cat again down below us. When she saw us, her fury seemed to return, and she made frantic efforts to get up the steep wall. Hutchison laughed as he looked down at her and said, "Goodbye, old girl. Sorry I injured your feelings, but you'll get over it in time. So long." And then we passed through the long, dim archway and came to the gate of the burg. When we came out again, after our survey of the beautiful old place, which not even the well-intentioned efforts of the Gothic restorers of 40 years ago have been able to spoil, though their restoration was then glaring white, we seemed to have quite forgotten the unpleasant episode of the morning. The old lime tree with its great trunk gnarled with the passing of nearly 9 centuries, the deep well cut through the heart of the rock by those captive of old, and the lovely views from the city wall whence we heard, spread over almost a full quarter of an hour. The multitude chimes of the city had all helped to wipe out from our minds the incident of the slain kitten. We were the only visitors who had entered the torture tower that morning, so at least said the old custodian, and as we had the place all to ourselves, were able to make a minute and more satisfactory survey than would have otherwise been possible. The custodian, looking to us as the sole source of his gains for the day, was willing to meet our wishes in any way. The torture tower is truly a grim place, even now when many thousands of visitors have sent a stream of life, and the joy that follows life, into that place. But at the time I mentioned it bore the grimmest and most gruesome aspects. The dust of ages seemed to have settled on it, and the darkness and the horror of its memories seemed to have become sentient in a way that would have satisfied the pantheistic souls of Philo or Spinoza. The lower chamber where we entered was seemingly, in its normal state, filled with incarnate darkness. Even the hot sunlight streaming in through the door seemed to be lost in the vast thickness of the walls, and only showed the masonry rough, as when the builder's scaffolding had come down, but coated with dust and marked here and there with patches of dark stain, which, if walls could speak, could have given their own dread memories of fear and pain. We were glad to pass up the dusty wooden staircase, the custodian leaving the outer door open to light us somewhat on our way. For to our eyes, the one long wicked, evil-smelling candle stuck in a sconce up the wall gave inadequate light. When we came up through the open trap in the corner of the chamber overhead, Amelia held on to me so tightly that I could actually feel her heartbeat. I must say for my own part that I was not surprised at her fear, for this room was even more gruesome than that below. Here there was certainly more light, but only just sufficient to realize the horrible surroundings of the place. The builders of the tower had evidently intended that only they who should gain the top should have any joys of light and prospect. There, as we had noticed from below, were ranges of windows, albeit of medieval smallness, but elsewhere in the tower were only a very few small narrow slits, such as were habitual in places of medieval defense. A few of these only lit the chamber, and these so high up in the wall that from no part could the sky be seen through the thickness of the walls. In racks, and leaning in disorder against the walls, were a number of headsmen's swords, great double-handed weapons with broad blade and keen edge. Hard by were several blocks whereon the necks of the victims had lain, with here and there deep notches where the steel had been through the guard of flesh and shored into the wood. Round the chamber, placed in all sorts of irregular ways, were many implements of torture, which made one's heart ache to see. Chairs full of spikes, which gave instant and excruciating pain. Chairs and couches with dull knobs, whose torture was seemingly less, but which, though slower, were equally efficacious. Racks, belts, boots, gloves, collars, all made for compressing at will. Steel baskets in which the heads could be slowly crushed into a pulp if necessary. Watchmen's hooks with long handle and knife that cut at resistance. This a specialty of the old Nürnberg police system, and many, many other devices for man's injury to man. Amelia grew quite pale with the horror of the things, but fortunately did not faint, for being a little overcome, she sat down on a torture chair, but jumped up again with a shriek, all tendency to faint gone. We both pretended that it was the injury done to her dress by the dust of the chair, and the rusty spikes which had upset her, and Mr. Hutcheson acquired in accepting the explanation with a kind-hearted laugh. But the central object in the whole of this chamber of horrors was the engine known as the Iron Virgin, which stood near the center of the room. It was a rudely shaped figure of a woman, something of the Bell Order, or, to make a closer comparison, of the figure of Mrs. Noah in the Children's Ark, but without that slimness of waist and perfect rondeur of hip which marks the aesthetic type of the Noah family. One would hardly have recognized it as intended for a human figure at all, had not the founder shaped on the forehead a rude semblance of a woman's face. This machine was coated with rust without and covered with dust. A rope was fastened to a ring in the front of the figure, about where the waist should have been, and was drawn through a pulley, fastened on the wooden pillar which sustained the flooring above. The custodian pulling the rope showed that a section of the front was hinged like a door at the side. We then saw that the engine was of considerable thickness, leaving just room enough inside for a man to be placed. The door was of equal thickness and of great weight, for it took the custodian all his strength, aided though he was by the contrivance of his pulley, to open it. This weight was partly due to the fact that the door was of manifest purpose, hung so as to throw its weight downwards, so that it might shut off its own accord when the strain was released. The inside was honeycombed with rust. Nay, more. The rust alone that comes through time would hardly have eaten so deep into the iron walls. The rust of the cruel stains was deep indeed. It was only, however, when we came to look at the inside of the door, that the diabolical intention was manifest to the full. Here were several long spikes, square and massive, broad at the base and sharp at the points, placed in such a position that when the door should close, the upper ones would pierce the eyes of the victim, and the lower ones his heart and vitals. The sight was too much for poor Amelia, and this time she fainted dead off, and I had to carry her down the stairs and place her on a bench outside till she recovered. That she felt it to the quick was afterwards shown by the fact that my eldest son bears to this day a rude birthmark on his breast, which has, by family consent, been accepted as representing the Nuremberg Virgin. When we got back to the chamber, we found Hutchison still opposite the Iron Virgin. He had been evidently philosophizing, and now gave us the benefit of his thought in the shape of a sort of exordium. Well, I guess I've been learning something here while Madame has been getting over her faint. Appears to me that we're a long way behind the times of our side of the big drink. We used to think the plains that the Injun could give us points in trying to make a man uncomfortable, but I guess your old medieval law and order party could raise him in every time. Splinters was pretty good at his bluff of the squaw, but this here young miss held a straight flush all high on him. The points of the spikes are sharp enough still, though even the edges are eaten out by what us are beyond them. It'd be a good thing for our Indian section to get some specimens of this here play toy to send round to the reservations just to knock the stuffings out of the bucks, and the squaws too, by showing them as how old civilization lays over them at their best. Guess but I'll get in a box a minute, just to see how it feels. Oh no, no, said Amelia, it is too terrible. Guess, ma'am, nothing's too terrible to the exploring mind. I've been in some queer places in my time. Spent a night inside a dead horse while a prairie fire swept over me in Montana territory, and another time slept inside a dead buffalo when the Comanches were on the warpath, and I didn't care to leave my yard on them. I've been 2 days in a caved in tunnel in the Billy Bronco gold mine in New Mexico, and was one of the 4 shut up for 3 parts of a day in the Casion, with slid over her side when we were setting the foundations of the Buffalo Bridge. I've not funked an odd experience yet, and I don't propose to begin now. We saw that he was set on the experiment, so I said, "Well, hurry up, old man, and get through it quick." "All right, General," he said, "but I calculate we ain't quite ready yet. The gentlemen, my predecessors, what stood in that there canister, didn't volunteer for the office, not much. And I guess there was some ornamental tying up before the big stroke was made. I want to go into this thing fair and square, so I must get fixed up proper first. I dare say this old galoot can rise some string and tie me up according to sample?" This was said interrogatively to the old custodian, but the latter, who understood the drift of his speech, though perhaps not appreciating to the full the niceties of dialect and imagery, shook his head. His protest was, however, only formal, and made to be overcome. The American thrust the gold piece into his hand, saying, "Take it, it is your pot, and don't be scared. This ain't no necktie party that you're asking to assist in." He produced some thin frayed rope and proceeded to bind our companion with sufficient strictness for the purpose. When the upper part of his body was bound, Hutchison said, "Hold on a moment, Judge. Guess I'm too heavy for you to tote into the canister. You just let me walk in, and then you can wash up regarding my legs." While speaking, he had backed himself into the opening, which was just enough to hold him. It was a close fit, and no mistake. Amelia looked on with fear in her eyes, but she evidently did not like to say anything. Then the custodian completed his task by tying the American's feet together, so that he was now absolutely helpless, and fixed in his voluntary prison. He seemed to really enjoy it, and the incipient smile, which was habitual to his face, blossomed into actuality, as he said, "Guess this here Eve was made out of the rib of a dwarf. There ain't much room for a full-grown citizen of the United States to hustle. We usser make our coffins more roomier in Idaho territory. Now, Judge, you just begin to let this door down, slow, onto me. I want to feel the same pleasure as the other jays had when those spikes began to move towards their eyes. Oh no, 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 broke in Amelia hysterically. It is too terrible. I can't bear to see it. I can't. But the American was obdurate. Say, Colonel, he said, why not take Madame for a little promenade? I wouldn't hurt her feelings for the world, but now that I'm here, having come 8,000 miles, wouldn't it be too hard to give up this very experience I've been pining and panting for? A man can't get to feel like canned goods every time. Me and the judge here will fix up this thing in no time, and then you'll come back, and we'll all laugh together. Once more the resolution that is born of curiosity triumphed, and Amelia stayed holding tight to my arm and shivering whilst the custodian began to slacken slowly, inch by inch, the rope that held back the iron door. Hutchison's face was positively radiant as his eyes followed the first movement of the spikes. Well, he said, I guess I've not had enjoyment like this since I left New York. Bar a scrap with a French sailor, a whopping. And that wasn't much of a picnic either. I've not had a show for real pleasure in this dod-rotted continent, where there ain't no bars, nor no engines, and where nary man goes healed. Slow there, Judge. Don't you rush this business. I want a show for my money this game, I do. The custodian must have had in him some sort of blood. The custodian must have had in him some of the blood of his predecessors in that ghastly tower, for he worked the engine with a deliberate and excruciating slowness, which after 5 minutes, in which the outer edge of the door had not moved half as many inches, began to overcome Amelia. I saw her lips whiten, and felt her hold upon my arm relax. I looked around for an instant, for a place whereon to lay her, and when I looked at her again, found that her eye had become fixed on the sight of the Virgin. Following its direction, I saw the black cat crouching out of sight. Her green eyes shone in danger lamps in the gloom of the place, and their color was heightened by the blood which still smeared her coat and reddened her mouth. I cried out, "The cat! Look out for the cat!" For even then she sprang out before the engine. At this moment she looked like a triumphant demon. Her eyes blazed with ferocity, her hair bristled out till she seemed twice her normal size, and her tail lashed out as does a tiger's when the quarry is before it. Elias P. Hutchison, when he saw her, was amused, and his eyes positively sparkled with fun, as he said, "Darn if the squaw hadn't got all her warm bait. Just give her a shove off if she comes any of her tricks on me, for I'm so fixed everlastingly by the boss that they're on my skin if I keep my eyes from her if she wants them. Easy there, Judge. Don't you slack that rope, or I'm euchred." At this moment Amelia completed her feint, and I had to clutch hold of her round the waist, or she would have fallen to the floor. Whilst attending to her, I saw the black cat crouching for a spring, and jumped up to turn the creature out. But at that instant, with a sort of hellish scream, she hurled herself, not as we expected at Hutchison, but straight at the face of the custodian. Her claws seemed to be tearing wildly as one of the Chinese drawings of the dragon's rampant, and as I looked I saw one of them light on the poor man's eye, and actually tear through it and down his cheek, leaving a white band of red where the blood seemed to spurt from every vein. With a yell of sheer terror, which came quicker than even his sense of pain, the man leaped back, dropping as he did so the rope which held back the iron door. I jumped for it, but was too late, for the cord ran like lightning through the pulley block, and the heavy mass fell forward from its own weight. As the door closed, I caught a glimpse of our poor companion's face. He seemed frozen with terror. His eyes stared with a horrible anguish, as if dazed, and no sound came from his lips. And then the spikes did their work. Happily the end was quick, for when I wrenched open the door they had pierced so deep that they had locked in the bones of the skull through which they had crushed, and actually tore him, out of his iron prison, till, bound as he was, he fell at full length with a sickly thud upon the floor, the face turning upwards as he fell. I rushed to my wife, lifted her up and carried her out, for I feared for her very reason if she would wake from her faint to such a scene. I laid her on the bench outside and ran back. Leaning against the wooden column was the custodian, moaning in pain, whilst he held his reddening handkerchief to his eyes. And sitting on the head of the poor American was the cat, purring loudly as she licked the blood which trickled through the gashed sockets of his eyes. I think no one will call me cruel because I seized one of the old executioner's swords and shore her in two as she sat. They used a lot of weird speech for Elias. Sorry that I messed up so much. I think it's time for bed now. Thank you for letting me stay in your room. Good night.